Hello, everybody. Today is the day for the live debate between myself and Nick Barksdale. We've decided to do this more so as a discussion than a actual debate. So, live from my phone. Bear with me, guys. All right. Making sure there's no interruptions. All right. There's Nick right there. Nick, let me know when you are in. Nick, how you doing?
How you doing, man? You doing all right?
Yeah, doing good, doing good. You excited, huh?
Yeah, man, I'm pumped, dude. I've been looking forward to this all day.
All right, cool. Me too, me too, me too. So, we let's get into it a little bit about myself, and then you can tell the audience about yourself. I am the author of I, Black Pharaoh, the book that's the novel that will be coming out around the fall time. I decided to write this book because just doing studies on ancient Egypt and the history of Egyptian, I felt like African history has been misrepresented over the years. So I decided that I wanted to tell a story from with an African imagery. As you saw in the group that I posted, where I met you, it caused a pretty big uproar,
Yeah, just a little bit. And I mean,
huh?
realistically, I think a lot of it has to do with, man, some people can be so ignorant in general. So I even acknowledge that I saw quite a few racially motivated comments and just flat out racist comments in general. Especially like, for example, the picture where it's a monkey basically wearing the pharaoh's crown and all that stuff too. And so I mean, stuff like that, it's uncalled for. If you can't make your case by using actual facts and references and sources, then I mean, they really don't have a case to begin with, and they're just ignorant. And the best part is people like us who use facts on a daily basis, those people just don't stand a chance. And so that's one thing I do enjoy about real historical discussions. Guys like me and you can discuss subjects like this without resulting to that kind of garbage. You know what I mean? So
Yeah. So why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
awesome. So my name is Nick Barksdale, which he already introduced me. I run the Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages, which is a popular Facebook page, but it's even more of a popular Facebook group, and it's also a very popular YouTube channel. I'm finally heading towards 20,000 subscribers, and I cannot wait to finally get over that 20K mark. Basically, what I do is I focus on ancient and medieval history. As you can see, my library behind me, it's almost all ancient and medieval history in general, and I love the subject, and I can't get into it enough. The subject we're going to be talking about today, I've studied for the past, realistically, off and on for the past 10 years. And so it's always been a really favorite subject of mine, although some of my buddies are definitely better at it than myself. So,
Mhm. Cool, cool. So what is like your interest with ancient Egypt? Is it just like everybody else's, the mysticism, the mystery behind Egyptian, or the origins, would you say?
I've always really enjoyed a little bit of everything. I will say, when it comes to mysticism of ancient Egypt, the religions of ancient Egypt is something that I do not know as well as others.
Mhm.
The origins of the ancient Egyptians and their, you could almost say, the evolution of their ethnography over time is something that's always interested me. I've always been obsessed with the ancient Near East, and Egypt does fall into that category. So I feel like it's natural for people to really look at the beginnings of the greatest world civilizations. So not just in ancient Mesopotamia, but also in North Africa and a variety of other places as well. It's always interesting to watch populations strive to achieve what certain groups like the ancient Egyptians did in fact achieve. It's always very interesting. So yeah, that's pretty much. What about you?
Well, for me, of course, I'm from Cameroon. My father is a Cameroonian man, and I just would love the idea of bringing to the world African history. Like I said earlier, I think it's been misrepresented. So I felt that I wanted to tell the story of an African telling the story, which has never been done before. It's never been done. So I wanted to be one of the first ones to do it. So let's get right into our discussion, man.
Yeah,
You know,
do it.
this is what the people is waiting for. So what would you say I'm gonna give my answer after you, but what would you say is your definition of a black person?
I mean, when it comes to that, I mean, like blackness or white or whiteness, I've honestly, I mean, I've always been pretty neutral. I know we can look at that as almost like a modern day social construct, which whether you're approaching it from a white angle or a black angle, in its own way, it can kind of get in the way of actual history and interpreting it. We've seen throughout history people use race for an ulterior motive. Usually race mixed with history, and especially race mixed with science, is never a good idea. Um, but I mean, I've always preferred the term person of color. Now that is just me. Just for the simple fact, I mean, here in Oklahoma, we have a large Hispanic population. And I mean, by certain definitions of black, if I were to walk up to them and be like, hey, do you consider yourself to be black? Realistically, they're going to look at me like I'm insane. You know what I mean? And so they did a study in actually Cairo not too long ago, and they asked various peoples, do you consider yourself to be black or African, or what do you consider yourself to be? And most people were shocked because they'd never really, I guess, thought of that. Most of them answered, well, no, I'm Arab or this or that, you know. And so it was interesting to see that. I mean, when it comes down to it, I mean, really, when it comes to that, I would say it's almost, I mean, how do you define yourself? I mean, you could say I'm white. I look at it, I mean, I'm Anglo-Irish. You know, I was born and raised in the USA. My ancestors come from Britain. And so, I mean, that's always how I've approached it. I think it really depends on how you look at that social construct and how you want to use your cultural definition for what's white, what's black, what's not, so on and so forth. I mean, I think that's a pretty even way of looking at it, but I'm definitely interested to hear your side as well.
Well, in certain, I wanted to include that in certain parts of Africa, like Ethiopia or Somalia and South Africa, these people don't even use the term black at all.
Yeah.
Okay, and these are some of the darkest skinned people that you're going to find that don't even use that term at all. Okay, this is a very Western or Euro American term. Okay, um, ancient people did not describe themselves as black, white, yellow, stuff like that. They didn't use colors. There was no race barriers or anything like that. What I look at black people, how I define it as any one of the dark races. As we had conversations on Facebook before, I've mentioned Indians, I've mentioned people from the islands, I've mentioned, of course, Africans, and Australians. Many Australians, the original Australians, were very dark-skinned people. So that's how I look at it. Now, does the Census of America look at it like that? Probably not, because
Yeah, I
that
can
would
agree.
create some problems if the black numbers were so high, you know. But I do agree. I do believe that the ancient the ancient people were people of color, and that led me to write my book, I Black Pharaoh. Okay. Now, the issue I take up with a lot of people have issues with are Indians black. Now, I know a bunch of red-skinned individuals, yellow individuals in America. The custom that we live by labels them black, African American. I tend to kind of have some issues with African American because just because you're dark skinned doesn't mean you're from Africa. You could have ancestors in India. You can have ancestors in South America. You can have ancestors in the islands. All these people kind of intermingle, you know, now. So there's really not too much of a pure race anymore anyway. But I would say that's my definition of what black is people of the dark races.
It's interesting. I'm gonna let you keep taking it from here, though. I'm gonna kind of like treat you like the host, basically. So I'll let you direct how this is, so on and so forth. You know, I feel
Okay.
like you have that right, since basically you made all this possible. You initiated the invitation to me, and so it's just look at it, I'm a guest in your house, basically. So
Okay. Cool. All right. So let's go on to this DNA test. The DNA test that was conducted, there was one in 1985. There was another one in 2010, on the people who are supposedly the family of King Tut, Tutankhamun. And there was another one in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you can correct me if I'm mistaken. What do you know about the DNA test?
I feel like, let me reference my notes. I brought notes. I'm horrible about that. I've got the memory span of a fly, and so I always have my notes.
Okay.
2017.
You mind if I talk about my beliefs on it while you read?
Oh yeah, go right ahead.
So in my own research, there was a lot of faulty things that came back with the research of the DNA tests. There were mixed, contaminated DNA samples from modern day people, modern DNA, mixed with ancient DNA, and that was in 2017. 2010, they found that to be faulty. It was another one that was done that was all found faulty to be faulty as well. I don't particularly know the exact reason. And then the most new recent one was also from unknown tombs that no one knows who these tombs came from. So basically, you have some dead people in Egypt that were buried. They didn't know where they came from or what era they even came from. And they said, hey, we're just going to test these mummies. So I found that to be a little strange. And like, okay, why would you do that? And you don't even know what family these people come from. Now, we know that Egypt has been invaded several times. So there were many different cultures that came into Egypt, and even some different rulers that came into Egypt and ruled over Egypt. So that information just wasn't good enough for me to accept it as fact.
I gotcha. And I will say, I mean, pretty much from my notes, they did that in 2017. They tested over, I believe, 151 mummies, which is a pretty large amount. Realistically, though, I believe it actually came down to the DNA sequences ended up being obtained from 90 mummies and would be compared to each other. But what's even more interesting, and you're right, due to the contamination, and not just modern contamination, but contamination from the past, really when it comes to testing ancient populations DNA, it's a really hard to do process, primarily because so much time and contamination has taken place. It's going to really conflict, which is why it's very interesting that we tested 151, but the actual conclusions we got were actually quite a bit smaller from that. And so that's actually very interesting. And that's as a matter of fact, I'm going to cut to the chase here.
Can you also tell me what were the results of some of those, just so the viewers can hear what were the results that were mentioned about where these people were supposedly from?
So this is what's actually very interesting. Let me find my place here real quick. So additionally, 3 of the Egyptians were analyzed for Y-DNA. 2 were assigned to the Middle Eastern haplogroup J, and 1 to the haplogroup E1B1B1, which is common in North Africa. I'm sure you're already aware. And on top of that, here.
Now, North African would consist of more Arabic or Arabics mixed with maybe individuals from Turkey and I want to say French. I'm not too sure. I could be mistaken.
And so basically what they found through this study is that a lot of these, and keep in mind, only a small amount of these mummies were able to actually be properly tested, in my opinion, just due to, like you said, contamination and time. But essentially, one thing they found that was very interesting is that some of these, I'm going to flip the page here, they found that their DNA population, or DNA, was actually common in the Levant, so basically the Middle East, which, like I said, that's not really a shock, especially when considering most of these mummies were from Lower Egypt rather than Upper Egypt, which realistically, you're going to have a much darker population the closer you get. I mean, the closer you get to Kush, the demographics are going to change, and that's natural. A lot of those populations were a little bit more isolated, had less interactions with outside groups, such as Europeans, people, Asiatics, so on and so forth. One thing they could find is that with this test, I actually shared the link earlier, but I'll go ahead and talk about it so people who were not involved in that conversation will know. Let me see here. The sub-Saharan African DNA actually, let me see, in those three individuals ranges from 6 to 15%, which is significantly lower than modern Egyptians, for example, from, I believe it's Abusir, who range from 14 to 21%. And so that was a pretty interesting find. But then again, like I said, I'm not really shocked because there were a lot more, there's a lot more traffic in that part of Egypt than there would be further down, essentially what you could say south.
Right.
But
And also, I kind of wanted to note that test was taken closer to the Cairo area, correct?
Hang on one second. I'm getting a little bit of interference. I don't know if it's on my end or possibly your end. I'm going to check my Wi-Fi settings real quick just to make sure.
Okay. Can you hear me clearly, though? Okay. All right, so Nick is checking out his Wi-Fi setting. So what I discovered in that whole, you can just click yourself back in, and I'll click you back on as soon as you get back on. What I discovered in that whole mix-up was inconclusive. It was inconclusive, and it was not valid enough to say that the ancient Egyptians were European. The results were saying they had a strong percentage of European and also a strong percentage of Middle Eastern mixed individuals that came into Egypt. And they said that they were like 2 or 3% sub-Saharan African, which would be considered Black African. So I'm going to continue till Nick signs back on, and we'll go from there. Now, then the next thing I was going to ask him about is, has North Africa been whitewashed? And I'm going to get into some quick examples right quick, just so y'all can see for yourself and answer this question for yourselves. I'm going to flip my phone around. See if I can pull Nick back in. There he is. All right. But I'm going to flip my phone around. I want to ask as he's coming in. You there, Nick?
Yes, there we go.
Good. All right, now I was going to start into my next question into, do you believe that Africa has been whitewashed in any way, in any shape, form, or fashion?
I think absolutely. I mean that's really not a shock. Africa has been a geographical location that really has been under siege from outside forces. I mean, if you want to go that far, I mean, as early back as the first Nakata period. Now, when it comes to like whitewashing in terms of history, propaganda, I mean, yeah, I can say that too. I've actually got quite a few books here that actually reference that, written by some of the best classic historians, such as Breasted, all the way up until now. And I mean, yeah, I mean, it truly has. In some cases, certain achievements have been overlooked. In some cases, I mean, you saw it in the other thread. People basically try to make ancient Egyptians look like, you know, guys who would be working on the BBC news network.
Right.
I think one thing we can agree with,
looking like Christian Bale.
Like Gods of Ancient Egypt. You remember that film that came out not too long ago?
Yeah.
And so it's stuff like that. I mean, realistically, that's been an approach since the very beginning. BBC actually did a mini series back in the day called The Cleopatras, and basically you've got these straight up British actors playing, I mean, Greek roles, Egyptian roles, and etc. So I mean, no, I mean, I believe it has been. However far you want to take it, as far as how much has been whitewashed, could be a debate. But that's, like I said, I'm going to let you take it from here. So.
Okay. All right. I think we agree on that. I think it's definitely been whitewashed. I want to show the viewers just a few pictures, just a few. And here's one of the great kings of ancient Africa. And that's Mansa Musa, supposedly.
One of the richest men in the world, from what I've read.
The richest man ever recorded. I think his worth was over 400 billion. And as you see how he's depicted here, that is not a man from Mali at all.
No, I can
So
agree with that.
that's something that I feel that has happened over time. And let's take a look at this picture here. This is the original. And then you look at this one. This stuff. This shows me that there is an agenda. So when I speak about these things, and when other historians speak about this, or African historians speak about this, the first label that is put on us is Afrocentric. So what is your view on Afrocentrics? And then you can tell me what's your view on Eurocentrics as well.
I think, well, one, Afrocentrism is a natural response to Eurocentrism. I mean, it's one of those things, Eurocentrism, when it's not focusing on European superiority, which, I mean, really boils down to racial superiority. It's basically trying to almost culture vulture the achievements and accomplishment of other groups. And Afrocentrism, at least what I've encountered a lot, is it is a response to Eurocentrism, but in a way, depending on who the person is, they can also be just as bad and conflicting as Eurocentrists. I mean, it's one of those things, you've got hate on both sides, right, and it's really sifting through that hate, sifting through that propaganda to actually see what the real historical truth actually is. When it comes to those two pictures you depicted, I will say, when it comes to history books, and especially history books written in the early 20th, 19th, and 18th centuries, you're going to definitely see some form of them lightening up the pictures. And I mean, really, it's pretty common. I will say, if you look at you're familiar with the famous smiting foe picture, yeah, correct? Mm-hmm. I always thought it was very interesting that they did use the same pigment on the Pharaoh and the Asiatic. That is something very interesting I would love to actually discuss later on. But if we're on the topic of Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism, I think both of them, they have this obsession with history. And there's nothing wrong with that until you make it a racially motivated obsession with ancient or history in general. Because then, I mean, you'll either bend the facts to support your narrative, or you will, I mean, sometimes create pure fictions whatsoever. I mean, you see people all the time, the Egyptians were nothing but white. The Egyptians were nothing but black. When in reality, my stance has always been that ancient Egypt as a civilization, now we can talk about the pre-dynastic period when there were definitely less foreign migrations in North Africa. We know that as early as the first Naqada period, that Asiatics were all over Lower Egypt, especially along the Nile, which is natural because that's going to be where the most resources are located. But I've always viewed ancient Egypt, especially when it reaches a stage to where it consolidates its power, it unites. I've always viewed it as a pretty multicultural, you could say multiracial society. You see that especially in their art. You do see a variety of skin tones, and I think we can both agree to that. But I mean, it really depends on just how you view it. I view it as a multicultural society who had constant interactions with not just Nubia or Kush, but also the Mediterranean, the Levant, so on and so forth. And you can definitely, I think, see that influence through those exchanges throughout the history of ancient Egypt.
I think Eurocentrism is way far worse than any form of Afrocentrism. I have never seen blackwashing particularly. I've never seen it. Now, I've heard some people say some extreme things. I've heard people say the ancient Hebrews were dark black people. I've heard the Moors civilized Europe, which is true. There were people from North Africa who went to Europe, okay, and helped civilize certain parts of Europe. That is true. I just recently found out that there was a black president before Obama, and there was a president before George Washington. This is new stuff to me that I'm just learning about. But also what I'm saying is Eurocentrism is basically saying that everything great that happened in the world is attributed to Europe. And that's really not true at all.
And
There
I
were,
can agree with you there for sure.
you know,
Absolutely.
and I'm not knocking Europe for the great things that they have done. We're currently under Anglo-European power right now, which evolved from the Roman power. So there's obviously Greeks. The Greeks did great things. The Romans did great things. The Chinese did great things. The Arab nations did great. My thing is when Africans speak about Africa, it's automatically labeled Afrocentric. And really, for people like me who actually are African, it's really not fair to try to put that racist term on someone who's doing something positive about their culture. That has, and particularly when we're talking about Africa, you look at most of the books. If you look at Shaka Zulu, which was a huge film in 1985, it was a huge. I don't know if you've seen the series. It
Oh
was
yeah,
huge by Josh
I definitely
Sinclair.
have.
I spoke with Mr. on a few occasions, and he's not an African man, and he's telling this African story. And this is all over African history, all over. There are not Africans telling these stories. This is why I decided to do what I'm doing with I, Black Pharaoh, the novel, is to tell it from an African perspective instead of people outside of Africa telling African stories. So that's my standpoint on
I feel like that's something that's pretty common. I mean, if you look at, I mean, they've always said like the victor writes history, right? Or paraphrasing, obviously. But I mean, if you look at like, for example, Irish history, many of the history books written about Ireland were almost always from an outsider's perspective. And so, I mean, when finally the time came, certain people tried writing their own history books. There was backlash for that because it paints the occupiers in a completely different light. I mean, let's face it, some of the things that England did do throughout Ireland today would be classified as a flat-out war crime or crimes against humanity. You can look at, for example, England bringing over the blacks and the tans. I mean, these guys literally murdered school children without any form of repercussion whatsoever, unless, of course, their repercussion was getting attacked by members of the IRA. And so, I mean, you see that throughout history. And now that, for example, people like yourself, you're working to put together your history of Africa and you're producing your own works. And so people are going to see another perspective. I don't know. Have you read the book Black Athena?
No.
You
I
definitely
just
should.
I just read one. I just read one by Thomas Brophy and Robert Bouval. I don't know if you heard of them. Very interesting book called Black Genesis, and he
I have
supports
heard
the
of it.
theory. He has supported, and I encourage everybody to go get that book. He supports the theory of the Black African ancient Egyptians, but he also talks more about the alien side as well as that has been thrown out there too, about the spiritual connection with the ancient Egyptians. All right, so let's get into this question. This is what everybody be talking about all over the world, and there's a lot of hatred comments, and I got a lot of them on my I Black Pharaoh universe page on Facebook about the actual origins of the ancient Egyptians. Now, when we look at
Okay.
these depictions, how do you believe when you see these depictions that the ancient Egyptians depicted themselves as? What type of people on the earth do you see they most resemble?
Like I said, I mean, I've always also, I mean, you can approach ancient Egypt through primary sources, and this is going to be groups like Herodotus, who typically paint Egypt in a very, I mean, there are descriptions that paint them as, you could say, multicultural. There are descriptions that, depending on your interpretation of certain words, that they're going to paint them either dark or black. I always say caution when applying that term to the entire people because certain people like Herodotus also use that same word to describe people on the steppes of Asia. And so we know that those people were extremely Asiatic. And so that's why the Greeks, in describing people darker than themselves, are going to use a very specific term. If you look at ancient Egyptian art, you're also going to see quite the contrast when it comes to skin color as well. It's kind of hard to show them right here, but I mean, I also have a variety of Egyptian art, and with the descriptions, whether it's from the British Museum, the Cairo Museum, so on and so forth, to where you do definitely see a diversity in skin tone. And I think that's one, like I said, I think that's pretty natural due to the amount of trade and migrations going in and out of North Africa. I'm really not shocked by that. I feel like to say as an entire population that they're either white or black, I think that's a little bit of a disservice to the diversity and achievements of ancient Egypt. I mean, just look at the Egyptian army, for example. There are records of Celtic soldiers fighting, realistically, probably as mercenaries in the Egyptian army. They also had some of the best bowmen in Africa fighting in their armies as well, which you're going to know I'm talking about. Kush had some of the best archers of the ancient world. And so, I mean, even their military had a certain diversity when it came to skin tone, but I'll also be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
My thoughts on it is they were Black African. I believe that the original native people of Egypt were Black African people. What you mentioned about the variety of colors, I mean, let's look at Africans now. We can look at African Americans as a prime example. Most African Americans do not have the same complexion. I mean, you talking ranging from darker than me to blue black to brown, my complexion, to yellow to copper to red. And that's the same in Africa, that people resemble that same thing. But now, if you look at Africans, Africans have very, very strong features. Africans have strong cheekbones. African have, broad, flat noses, particularly, and big, broad lips. And this is what we see in most of those statues up until the 29th or 30th dynasty. Now, don't get me wrong. There were other people from other nations, such as the Hyksos, which were more Asiatic people, such as the Assyrians, who would conquer places like Egypt, and they'll leave their pharaoh there, but they would rule over the pharaoh, okay? And they would send some of their people in there, Egypt, and basically be governors in Egypt. So that has happened. There was mixing of races. I agree with that. Do I believe Europeans were there in the early stages? I do not believe that at all. I do not believe the Europeans actually came into Egypt up until the Romans and the Greeks came in. So, can you hear me clear? I'm hearing a little interference.
A little bit. I'm getting a little bit of an interruption. Occasionally, you'll kind of lag, and your voice echoes just a little bit. Am I coming in clear on your side?
Yeah, you coming in clear on my side.
Okay. I will say. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I believe they were Black African people, and when I say Black, I don't mean, and I think this is what a lot of people take issue with. I'm not saying Black is just, it's a variety of complexions. It's not just dark brown people. It's a variety of complexions. My mother was a yellow-skinned woman. She was yellow, okay? So it can range anywhere from that yellow complexion and still be African, or that reddish complexion and still be African. You can't, just because you're red skinned doesn't mean you're still not African. So I think they were Black African people as the native people. And obviously there was some mixing that that took place over the years.
Yeah, and I mean, that is, like I said, I mean, that is natural. As I stated earlier, I feel like when you get into like the pre-dynasty era of ancient Egypt, I think you are going to have, I mean, especially the farther down south that you go, a much darker, or if you would prefer, Black African population. When it comes to Lower Egypt, though, the closer you get to the Middle East, the closer you get to the Mediterranean, I do see that the skin color is definitely changing. I know that we know throughout not only archaeology, but forensic osteology, that many skulls have been discovered throughout that date to a certain era that show that Asiatics were in it'd be Lower Egypt before the first Naqada, which is when some of the first real interesting art forms actually develop along the Nile. And so we do, and you can actually reference the lectures of Bob Breyer on this one, for example, too. But he basically goes to describe the Asiatics' migrations down into North Africa and their settlement up along the Nile Valley. And that is
Exactly.
very interesting because, I mean, bones in their own way, bones do definitely tell a story. And that's why I've always viewed ancient Egypt, when it establishes itself as a civilization, as a empire per se, a unified collection of states underneath one um, entity, that you do see a heavily multicultural society. And also, I mean, that's another thing too. It depends on how much, because for example, Greek sources actually differentiated the ancient Egyptians from their neighbors in Africa, what is now Africa. And I've always said, one, I've always had an issue using the term Africa before the Third Punic War or the aftermath of the Third Punic War, because I think sometimes that can paint a slightly misleading picture. We know that Africa described, and this is actually what's very important to me, it described a series of territories in North Africa that were at one point underneath Phoenician control, but later we know it as the Carthaginian Empire.
Hmm.
They lost the war, the Romans come in, they resettle it, what they didn't wipe off the face of the earth, unfortunately, and
Right.
they basically establish Africa as a province. What's interesting is that Egypt was not included in that province. Egypt,
Mhm.
known as, I think it's pronounced Egyptus, would be its own province in the Roman Empire. But even before the Romans, even the ancient Greeks distinguished between the ancient Egyptians and their neighbors, especially also when it came to skin tone as well. I'm seeing some comments pop up. I'm trying to read them as they
Oh yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah.
So,
He's
and I mean, honestly, when it comes to art, and there's the issue of, like I said, like the actual unedited picture of the smiting, the smiting of the foes. He's got a variety of people by their head, right, or by their hair.
Mhm.
And I've always thought it was
And you're
interesting
talking
that
about
they
King
did
Tut, correct?
technically.
Is that King Tut or
Actually,
Ram?
it should be. I'm just gonna fact check myself before I speak. No, it's Ramesses II.
Okay, okay.
He's the
Yeah,
one
I seen that
depicted
picture.
basically. Uh, He's the pharaoh. He's holding an Asiatic by the head, also holding what appears to be a Nubian by the head of their hair,
Mhm.
and it's him basically dominating them in the conflict that occurred, so on and so forth. But it's interesting that they used the same pigment on the Asiatic that they also used on the pharaoh. And so, like I said, I think that's one thing that does hint at quite a bit of diversity. Not only that, the forensic osteology and the facial reconstructions they've done based on those features. Forensic osteology is still used across the globe, especially to identify the race or what a person looked like of burn victims, for example. They're also used heavily in war crimes and stuff like that. And that's kind of shows the legality and the validity of the actual art itself and the science when it comes to trying to accurately figure out what a person looked like. You can see the uproar that occurred when one of Britain's oldest men, they did a facial reconstruction, and he turned
Oh
out, I'm
yeah.
sure you know, to be
He
incredibly
turned out to be
dark.
black with blue
So
eyes.
that
Yeah.
caused a huge uproar, just like when they did the King Tutankhamun reconstruction. He turned out to be a lot lighter than they thought before, and so that also caused a massive uproar in other circles as well. Um,
That was disgusting. That was
the
completely
Tutankhamun
disgusting.
one.
Compared to what King Tut portrayed himself to be. There's pictures of King or paintings of sculptures of King Tut where he painted himself mostly red skin, and there's some where he's just jet black, which also I wanted to get to those jet black pictures. That there's actually a lot of guys from Cairo mention this a lot when they see Tutankhamun trampling over very black skinned people. They're saying that King Tut was trampling over the black Nubians or the black Cushites as if he wasn't black. Now they're creating this facade as if that Africans never went to war with other Africans. And even if King Tut was a lighter skinned African and Cushites were darker skinned, because even in Sudan today, those are some of the darkest people on the planet, very dark people. So is it far-fetched that King Tut may have been a brown-skinned man and he was going to war with darker-skinned Africans or darker-skinned Nubians or darker-skinned Ethiopians? Absolutely, he did. And he also these Egyptians also went to war with Mediterranean individuals, individuals from Babylon, individuals from Assyria. So you see all of these things, not just him beating up black Nubians, as they try to say that, that was your people. That was your people that King Tut was beating up. And I really disagree with that.
No, I mean, I get that. When it also comes to skin color and statues, what are your thoughts on Rahotep and Nofret?
I don't really know who those ones are. I don't remember seeing the skin complexion. Do you have any? You have any pictures
It's
up?
going to be actually hard for you. I can send you the link afterwards. I can even post
Okay.
it in the comment section so other people can see it. But essentially, the woman is extremely pale
Uh-huh.
white, to where the man resembles what would have been probably a person in the Middle East during that time period.
Okay. I wouldn't disagree with that. And I also believe that there were, like I said earlier, that there was individuals who came from different lands that ruled as governors. Even the Bible talked about Joseph being somewhat of a ruler in Egypt. So there were other people from other nations that ruled Egypt. Again, when these people came in and conquered, if they allowed you to live, if you surrendered, they may let you live and rule over your land still, reporting only to them. Kind of like how Spartan 300, where Artaxerxes met Leonidas and he said, just serve me, bow to me, and you can rule your people. So this is kind of how the ancient world was. They allowed a lot of people to live as long as they would serve them as the Lord overall.
What are your thoughts on the skin tones of various members of the royal family and its reflection on the actual populations of ancient Egypt? So basically, on non-royals.
For example, I believe that royal families were the ones affected the most when it comes to when someone comes into the throne from a different land, they're going right after the royal family. That just makes sense. If I'm coming to take over Egypt and I'm from Asia or somewhere or the Middle East or I'm Assyrian or something, I'm coming for the royal family. And when I paint myself as the new king of Egypt, obviously I'm going to look like I look. So yes, I believe that has happened in different dynasties in Egypt, preferably mostly after the 30th dynasty, but there were dynasties in between where, like I said, the Hyksos ruled, the Babylonians ruled, the Assyrians ruled, and then after that, the Greeks and the Romans ruled, and certainly around the time of Cleopatra. So that's happened too. So I definitely believe the royal family might have been affected, why some of the common people were still the same Egyptian.
Okay. Do you think that their skin color could have reflections on the local populations?
Possible. It's possible. If,
So
like I said,
possibly.
if I come in and take over Egypt, I'm going to bring some of my people with me. You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
this this is the same thing that happened in the United States. When over 300 or 400 years ago, when you have individuals coming from Europe, it wasn't just 300 years later. You don't see many natives around. Okay, and that's just 300 years. We're talking about an empire that's over 3,000 years old, which is the Egyptian empire that we're talking about. There were many lapses and many people coming in, doing many different things and bringing their people in when they came in. This was the Bible describes this place, and I refer to the Bible a lot because I'm a Bible believer.
I got you. I'm not so much, but I can see your standpoint.
Right. The Bible refers to Egypt as the first world power. Okay, describes it as the old one of the oldest world powers and the first, not the first civilization, but the first world power. So this is a place like the United States is today that everyone comes to and everyone wants to be a part of. There's Herodias spoke about times where he was upset with Egyptian priests for not giving him all the knowledge that he requested. So Egypt kept a lot of their stuff secluded. They didn't just give it out to everybody, but they definitely did help spread knowledge throughout the whole world.
I gotcha. Considering that we know that outsiders were all over Lower Egypt before, I mean, even in the pre-dynastic era, do you think that that outside influence could have had an effect on the local populations in what would eventually become the Egyptian Empire?
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
then maybe
You don't see very if you're in Cairo, you don't see many people my complexion at all, at
yeah,
all. Maybe if you go to Aswan or Luxor or places like that in Nubian areas, you may see more darker people. You're going to see pretty much all darker people in there. But when you're talking about Cairo, you're going to see mostly Asiatic or what they would call Arab-looking people.
yeah. So then would you, at least in with all that being put out on the table and us talking about that, the outsider influence, the migrations in the North Africa in the pre-dynastic era, would that lead you to say that ancient Egypt could technically have been a very if you prefer, ethnic society?
Yes, I believe over time it became very multi-ethnic. But again, black is dominant, white or Asiatic is a recessive. So if I were to have a child with of Asian or Caucasian, they're gonna be black. There may not be dark black, but they're gonna be black. They're gonna that dominant feature of African is going to be more dominant than a recessive skin complexion. So
Yeah.
that just would yes. They would no longer be
So
Caucasian.
what are your thoughts? Do I go ahead?
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm turning to my notes real quick. Bear with me 1 second. When is your book going to get published, or when is it coming out?
We're looking for the fall right now. We're working on some pictures. We want to put pictures in there because I'm really big on imagery. The writing is actually done. They're doing the editing process now, and we're working on the pictures. So we're looking at the fall. Yeah, for the release.
That's not bad at all. That's very, very awesome. Are you excited?
No, oh man, I'm ecstatic about it. Because the hardest part was finding the publisher. That was the hardest part. Writing the book was not hard at all, but actually getting the publisher to believe in it, that was tough. That was tough because everybody knows this is a very controversial subject, and
oh yeah, absolutely.
Some people don't want no parts of any controversy.
I actually have a question for you, if that's okay.
Okay.
So you brought up Herodotus earlier, and
Mm-hmm.
him talking about his dealings with the ancient Egyptian priests and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on the fact that he used basically almost the same word to describe ancient Egyptians that he used to describe people living on the steppes in Asia?
That's interesting. But what I do know is that he came in after the time, I believe, after Artaxerxes, correct? If I'm not mistaken. So this probably would have been around the time where that great mixing in the royal house would have occurred. So I wouldn't doubt that he saw a strong case of Asiatics in when he came in by the time he had come in.
Okay. I actually, not one to misdirect the subject, you had mentioned a question. I've actually been kind of really interested on talking about this, the defamation of ancient Egyptian statues.
Mm-hmm. The facing of the noses.
Go ahead and discuss that, or would you like to wait until a later time?
Yeah, we could discuss it now. From my observation, you're talking about over 1,776 that I've heard of. And that's just what I've heard of. Noses, the attacking of the nose. To me, I know exactly what it looks like. The nose is a direct representation of what African people shows you clearly what African people are. The noses and the lips give you a very clear view of who these people were. According to my knowledge and what I've studied, this happened around the time of Napoleon's time when he came into ancient Egypt. That he saw these grand faces, these black faces, these sphinx and all this stuff all over the place. and he decided, oh no, oh no, 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 no. And they made it a point to deface so many noses. People cannot convince me that all of these noses just dropped off. You know, there was some sort of agenda there to blow off all of those noses, particularly despite those faces. So you could not identify who these people actually were. But the cheekbones on these people are still intact. They still look like Africans, but that nose would show you a lot clearer view of who they actually were.
So my response to that, and this is, I mean, I think it could be a little bit of that. I think this is actually a very interesting aspect too. Certain historians have proposed a theory that in many cases the noses were removed because of the ancient Egyptians' views on the afterlife and mysticism and life after death. They actually believe that many of these Egyptians viewed these statues as something capable of having a life force. Not that the statue would like move around or anything like that, but that it still contained the live essence of that person. And they looked at, by taking off the nose, they removed the person's ability to breathe. Therefore, it couldn't actually contain a life force. The second thing that I actually really like about this is ancient Egyptian iconoclasm and the basically political and religious rivals that would, kind of like what we do today, deface certain people's statues after death.
I feel like if you were going to just do that, you might as well have just destroyed them. You know, you might as well just have crushed the statue all the way together if you were just going to just blow off the nose. But I mean, that is a theory. It's not a theory I believe. I don't believe that you would just blow off the noses just because you thought these people were still breathing or somehow, some way. I don't know. I know I've heard that theory. I don't know if I don't think I agree with that one at all. Okay, so we talked about black people, right? Now, most census tell us that black people are African Americans and sub-Saharan African people. That's what the term black stands for. What do you think about that? Do you agree with that? Are those the only black people in the world? Is people from Central and South Africa, which is sub-Saharan, and African American people?
Well, in reality, give me 1 second. I'm switching to where I can actually see people's comments. That way I'll actually know what they are, what they're asking as well. Let me see here. So, I mean, like I said, I think when it comes to blackness, and stuff like that, I think that's more of a cultural concept that we have today. Like, for example, your definition of black may vary according to someone else's definition of black. It's kind of like I brought up earlier. If I were to walk up to someone who's darker than me, like someone who's Hispanic living in Oklahoma, and if I asked them, hey, do you consider yourself to be black? I mean, like I said, they would look at me like I was, crazy or in need of glasses. I mean, you know, it's one of those things that really determines on what is black to you, what is white to you, and how do you go from there? For example, even the ancient Greeks did technically have an opinion on skin color. The Gauls, in their opinion, would have been too white. That's the Celtic-speaking peoples. Some of the people in Africa, possibly too dark. Even Romans had a similar view, and that's actually very interesting. If you actually look at Egypt underneath Roman occupation, are you familiar with any of the racial laws they had in place, especially on inheritance and marriage? It's very interesting. And however much Egyptian you were, or however much Greek that you were, that they could figure out by looking at your ancestry that you had, that determined not only who you could legally marry, but it also determined on who would actually get so much money, or however much of the estate that they inherited. And so that's a very interesting, I've always found it funny that technically people could say the way we view race today is how people in the ancient world viewed not only language, but material culture. For example, the Greeks considered pretty much anyone who didn't speak Greek to be a barbarian or a barbar. by our
Hmm.
standards, we could take some of the worst racial slurs in our day to day. Barbar as a term, or barbarian, would be literally the equivalent in the ancient world. I'm seeing more comments
Hmm.
pop up here.
Oh yeah, we got a lot. What this brother Zahid Bey stated that um, where the origins of melanated people. And like I said before, I mean, I believe anyone of melanated skin complexion is black. If you have skin that you don't need suntan to put on in the sun, your skin is you're black. You know, one way or the other. That's how I look at it. Some people may look at it very different. Some people may look at it different. But if you're of the dark races, I believe you're black. And some people don't consider themselves black at all. I've mentioned earlier that even Ethiopians, Somalians, they don't use that term, I'm black. So if you've met one of them, if you ever met one of them and say, hey, do you consider yourself black? They're like, no, because they look at that term black as to be equivalent to African American. They don't look at that as a term that they use for themselves at all. Same thing
Yeah.
with South Africans. They don't use that at all. So um,
So,
now let's talk about the
with that
20.
being said,
Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
let me just interject real quick. With that being said, since they would not consider themselves to be black, would you say that your cultural definition of black may not necessarily apply to not just certain peoples living in Africa because they themselves don't necessarily consider themselves that? Do you think that that could also carry over to the ancient world and ancient history?
Well, unfortunately, I am American, so it is the term black is a Western term, as I mentioned earlier. You know, this stuff wasn't used in the ancient days. It, people didn't look at each other and say, "Hey, he's black," or "He's blacker than me," or "He's white." It was more culturalism. If you believe in Amun Ra and this person believed in Zeus and that person believed in Selassie, we could be rivals based off that or custom. If you ate a certain thing and I didn't eat, or you dressed a certain way, or you did certain things, or had certain rituals in your land, that would make us different. That stuff, that racial stuff of black and white and yellow and red, that didn't come about until the European powers, for real, to be honest. Africans didn't have that amongst each other. They didn't look at the Cushites and said, well, these real black people. They didn't say things like that. You know, that just wasn't things that were done. That's not how people looked at each other. And there's no record of them looking at each other in color or race hate particularly.
Can I interject right here, real quick, if you don't mind?
Hmm. Hmm.
Just with a counterpoint before I lose track. I want your opinion on this. This is actually a very great book. I've had the privilege to actually talk to the author via
Hmm.
email correspondence and stuff like that. And the title is called Race, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. And it's
Hmm.
similar to other wonderful books such as Racial Prejudice in Imperial Rome, and also The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity.
Hmm.
This book actually goes into details on how the ancients, though they didn't necessarily view race the way me and you possibly view race, they
Hmm.
still definitely recognized the differences between their populations, such as, for example, in slave markets, to where the buyers were a darker skinned people, it was not actually uncommon for the slavers to actually take chalk and use it on the people's legs and feet to let their buyers know that they weren't actually buying locals. What are your thoughts on that?
That's interesting. You know, but it's kind of a surprise to me. You know, in Africa, let's talk about slavery in Africa. Slavery existed in Africa too. It was called servitude, though.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So if I decided to go to war with your nation and we conquered your nation, we would give you two options. You would become servant or you would be killed. Many people decided to be servants. Now they would serve in their house for a period of time, prove their loyalty, and some of
Sounds
them
like the
would,
better choice, huh?
right, some of them would be set free, but they would have to become part of that nation that they actually were slaves of. So, yes, I'm sure there were some social and economical injustices on those individuals, but it was nothing like what occurred here in America, where people were actually not even seen as human. That was a completely different form of slavery. So when these Africans were selling other Africans, or maybe slaves or whatever they were, servants, or just common people, they probably had no clue what was going to occur when they got across that ocean.
That's true. I don't want to get too much on that because I feel like that's kind of throwing us in a completely different era.
Hmm.
I kind of want to stay on the topic of ancient history. I will say
Hmm.
that I think, one, I mean, for example, if you took slavery in ancient Rome, man, it
Hmm.
doesn't matter what color you were. I mean, you were literally the equivalent of a subspecies. I mean,
Right,
not even considered human. So, I
right,
mean, really, slavery has pretty much sucked for all slaves throughout human history. I think we can pretty much agree on
absolutely.
that.
And
But I will say
even,
this:
mm, I'm
in
sorry,
certain
I cut you off. Go
Egyptian
ahead.
depictions of no, you're fine. Even certain Egyptian depictions of slavery shows them not only counting them like almost like cattle, but also they've got the rods in the air ready to basically smack them, beat them,
Hmm.
physically
Right,
abuse them if they even remotely get out of line. And I mean,
right.
that looks like typical slavery to me.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
But I
Because
mean,
remember,
that is a pretty
I'm sure you've
interesting.
heard the term of hitting, beating someone like a Hebrew slave. And, Egyptians were, even the Bible says Egyptians
Oh
were the
yeah,
ones who enslaved Israelite people. So, and they were mistreated very badly. So I agree with that.
I'm going to actually ask a question. I feel like a couple people in our audience here would probably like to have their views met. Would it be okay if I read some of these out loud?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay,
Go
cool.
ahead. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
getting a little bit of lag on, I think maybe my end, so if I cut out, I do apologize. One person,
Okay.
Nathan Sholin, commented, then why was there such a distinction in Egyptian history when it came to referencing the kingdom of Cush? Um, I think, in short, why are they specifically referred to as the Black Pharaohs? And he put that
Hmm.
they ruled for about 70 years. I think it was 85 years. I could be wrong. I'm not going to get
Right.
into strict semantics on that. And that they basically adopted Egyptian customs. And you can
Hmm.
actually see that with the reflections of the Kushite pyramids and so on and so forth, which are still technically distinctly different. What are
Right.
your thoughts on that?
Well, I do not believe the Kushite dynasty was the only quote unquote black dynasty. That's number one. I believe the Kushite dynasty was another form of Africans that came into and took over Egypt for a period of time. But this is something that was brought to life when Zahi Hawes, I don't know if you're aware of who he is,
I am.
discovered the tomb in Sudan and realized that these people were ruling in Egypt for a very long time. I forgot the exact pharaoh's name, but when he discovered this, he said, okay, there were black pharaohs because this man was that they discovered was very, very dark and painted very, very dark. So when that happened, they said, we have to put this in there that black pharaohs did exist, but that wasn't the only black pharaoh. They may have been blacker than the average Egyptians, but they were still African people. So I don't believe the 25th dynasty was the only dynasty. And when people mention it, it's kind of like how you do Black History Month, where it's the smallest, you got the small days out the year. So obviously that was one of the smaller reigns in Egyptian history. So of course people would mention the 25th dynasty as the quote unquote only black
I
dynasty.
got you. I want to answer one person real quick. She had commented, her last name is Tucker. She had
Hmm.
commented that once we started talking about the ancient Egyptian DNA, the videos kind of messed up a little bit. And so I wanted
Okay.
to clarify to her real quick what I was talking about. That
Hmm.
way she doesn't feel left out on this discussion. Let her know that her question was answered. Basically, when we were talking about the DNA test done on these mummies, only a small percentage of them actually produce certain results. And one thing they found out that was very interesting is that these mummies actually contained less sub-Saharan African DNA than modern day Egyptians actually have. Modern day Egyptians actually have a slightly higher percentage, which basically, according to this study, would implicate that certain populations did not see an increase in sub-Saharan African DNA until after the post-Rome period. So this is going to be basically when Roman Egypt falls to the outsiders from the Middle East. And so that's another interesting concept right there. But it will say specifically, and I don't want to do it injustice by leaving it out, the people who actually conducted this test stated they didn't want their studies to be misrepresented, which in many cases it can be and has been. They said that these mummies specifically came from Lower Egypt, and so it's natural that they are going to have a less sub-Saharan African DNA percentage because they are closer to interactions with peoples from the Middle East and the Mediterranean.
Right, right. But what I found was deception is that that was not included in those articles. I mean, you're talking about I had this
It
is
actually
research.
is. Yeah.
It is?
If
Okay.
you click on the sources listed, the scientists who conducted the survey and the actual testing themselves, they do actually include that in the references. They wanted to make sure, like most scientists, that their work is not misconstrued for
Hmm.
ill purposes, if that makes sense. Nathan Sholin commented again. He wants to know your opinion on contamination on these ancient mummies, how that contamination would have occurred in seal mummies.
Well, when you talk about contamination, they found DNA from modern day people, modern DNA. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? That tells you that there was some mixing of modern DNA with ancient DNA. So that's how it became contaminated. If to answer that question, why they were mixing modern DNA, I have no clue. And here's the thing I want to say about DNA testing. Okay, when they say that there's a certain amount of people that um, uh, there's a certain amount of gene or blood type with or sub-Saharan African, with every sub-Saharan African, my question is, has everyone in sub-Saharan Africa done a DNA test for them to know exactly the blood type or DNA type of every single black person in the world? They have not. So how do they come up with these theories that this is the exact blood type of every sub-Saharan African? I find it very hard to believe a lot of these DNA tests because they have not tested everybody, so and I know so many people around the world that has never had a DNA test once in their life. So where are they coming up with this is what every sub-Saharan African person, this is their DNA type. It's like this, it's H, it's Y, it's this, it's J. Where does that come from? How do you even come to that assumption when everyone has not even been tested in DNA?
Would that logic also apply to, for example, Irish people in DNA?
I would say this. I would say the same thing with everyone. You
Okay.
know, you can't specifically say people from one region when you've never tested everyone in the world have this specific. So what you can say is the people who we have tested in this region have this type of blood type or this type of DNA from the people we have tested. But when you start saying things like everyone from Northern Africa or everyone from the Middle East or everyone from Europe has this blood type, I'm just not going to agree with that at all, and I think that's completely inaccurate.
Okay, I understand that. I understand that. Where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's see what the people got to say because I'm pretty much I put all my questions out there. We talked about the DNA test. We talked about the complexions of ancient Egyptians. We talked about the 25th dynasty, which is very important in mentioning of the Black pharaohs. Okay, here is one. Here is one question that I missed.
Yeah.
Do you believe that the current people in Cairo, the current Egyptians, the people who are considered the Egyptians, are the same people as the native ancient Egyptians?
And I mean, they've also done study. I mean, one, the genetics are not going to be 100% the same. I mean, that's just, the DNA is not going to be the same. That's just due to a variety of different populations, as you stated, basically mixing and interacting with each other. That's why, for example, according to those mummies tested from, I mean, literally, I mean, we're talking millenniums, they technically had less sub-Saharan African DNA than a majority of, you could say, the Egyptians living there today. And so obviously there is quite a bit of a difference. For example, I mean, the Asiatics in North Africa before the first Naqada period, they weren't Assyrians. You know, they were completely, these were different peoples. I mean, you have all these different peoples coming in, whether it's Libyans, Cushites, Assyrians, Greeks, Romans, I mean, the Hyksos. You even have, I mean, which it's a big debate on whether or not they're the same, but I mean, you also have, I mean, the sea peoples coming out of nowhere, which we know were also, for the most part, a lot of people consider them to be European. For example, the Philistines and arguably the Phoenicians may have also come from these people too, and so they also hit Egypt. And so you've got a variety of peoples all going into the same spot. And so, I mean, realistically, that's why I've always stated, after, when you actually have the dynasties start rolling in and Egypt establishes itself as a power in the ancient world, I've always viewed it as a very multiracial, multicultural society, which with all empires, that's pretty much a given. I don't believe any nation can get to that point without having a population like that.
And some of the things you said, I agree with. I believe they're not the same people. And again, I go back to what's happened here in the United States just over 400 years, 300 or 400 years, changes of how this country is now from the where it was before. And you were talking 3,000 years, and then after that, some more 3,000 years. The changes happened. So you're talking about a dynasty 3,000 years old and more thousands of years after that, where all these different races are flocking to Egypt and claiming Egypt and saying there and living in Egypt. I do not believe they're the same people. The people who are there now are more people from Turkey, more people from the Arab nations that run Egypt. And that's an Islamic state, just like Carthage is now. I don't believe Carthage is what it used to be. These are completely new people there. A lot of the original Egyptians went south. Even the last king of the pharaohs, I posted about him earlier. He was the last native pharaoh. I think his name was Nekhtebu, Pharaoh Nekhtebu, and he fled to Ethiopia after Artaxerxes came in. He fled to Ethiopia and fled to Nubia. So a lot of the Egyptians, the original Egyptians, did that. They fled to the Nubian area to blend in with the other people that were there when all these nations started coming in. So I don't believe they're the exact same people that they once were. Now, am I going to say that some of these people don't have some bloodlines connecting to those people? I'm not going to say that because I don't know that. But I don't believe these are the exact same family members of the original pharaohs of the first 30 dynasties of Egypt.
How many of the dynasties of ancient Egypt would you consider to be non-African?
Anything after the 30th dynasty. And again, that's not to say, and I'm talking more so the common people than the royal families. When we talked earlier, we talked about, different people coming in and how royal families were changed up. And then again, you talk about people bringing some of their people into these nations, into Egypt as well. I believe that happened. But I don't believe the native people were completely decimated at that point and before the 30th dynasty. I believe they were still there until the 30th dynasty. And then after that, they started getting pushed out slowly but surely.
So you would say after the 30th dynasty is when you definitely have as far as now, are you referring to simply the royals or are you referring to the actual majority population?
I would say the majority of population started to change.
Okay.
Started to change. Egypt has always been a beautiful place. Everybody wants to be there. So,
Absolutely.
but over time, different nations started setting up shop and pushing those natives away.
So out of curiosity, why do your views differ on the oldest man in Britain reconstruction versus the Tutankhamun reconstruction?
I don't even, to be honest, the oldest Britain man, I saw that. I didn't really dig into it too much, to be honest. I'm not into trying to make European history African history. That's not my thing. That's what quote unquote Afrocentric would do. I'm
Yeah.
talking about my thing is African history. That's my thing. Correcting the imagery on African history. I don't care about what happened in other nations because I believe that history has been solidified. I believe Roman history, Greek history, uh, Chinese history, those Arab nation histories, those histories has been solidified. It's Africans Africa who has the issue with people coming in and saying they've done great things in Africa and all these different nations saying we're the North Africans or separating Africa from Africa. And it's just that's my issue. That's what I'm dealing with, Africa.
Okay. My question is, Africa as a geographical location and what we define as Africa has changed over time.
Hmm.
So, in your opinion, do you base African history off of the entire continent now or off of portions? Like, for
Portions.
example, Africa originally.
I would say portions. I would say portions because there's so many countries and tribes in Africa. But listen, Nick, I hate to do this, but my phone is at 1%. One great more question I can answer, and then we gotta go.
Okay. What's your opinion? Could you say that since part of Egypt is technically in Asia, what is your thoughts on that?
Well, I believe that over time, I believe in those days the continents were closer together anyway. So a lot of things spread from Africa, Middle East, Asia, and on and on and on and on throughout the world. Is it far fetched that there were Asians close to Africans? Absolutely not. And when you do your research, most Asians realize how close they are related to Africans in many different fashions. And I'm talking about just clothing designing. I'm talking about a lot of things they know how close they are to African people.
It's kind of like a quick follow-up question. I don't want to take up too much of your phone battery. You
Hmm.
mentioned possibly taking African history in portions as Africa slowly became larger as a designated geographical area. Used to
Hmm.
Africa only referred to a small portion of the
Hmm.
continent before eventually encompassing the entire area. So,
Hmm.
since ancient Egypt and its civilizations throughout most of its dynasties was not technically considered to be Africa during that time period, would that have any way affect your view on Egypt as an African civilization?
No, I've always thought Egypt was part of Africa. I've never thought it was anything separate. I thought it,
Even
yes,
though
it shares that little plane right there with what is that, Israel. But I've always considered, and I've considered some parts, like I said, in the continents were closer. I would consider India to be very close to Africa when the continents were closer. So, that's pretty much my standpoint on that. But I've always considered it to be African, always.
Interesting, interesting. I definitely want to have a follow-up conversation sometime if that's all right with
Yeah,
you. I think that'd be pretty
yeah.
interesting. So,
I would love it, man. This was great. I think this is educational for people. We do have some differences in opinion on matters, but I think we carried ourselves well, and definitely we can follow and do this again live on your channel, live on my channel, and put it out there to the world because people need to see conversations with people with different views, still having civil conversations and not arguing, screaming about this, that, and the third.
oh yeah, I agree. And one thing I love about this is I've seen videos between academics who have a better education than I ever will. And you know what I love about this? The fact that me and you have acted this way throughout the entire discussion, when academics have literally acted like almost, I mean, just ignorant animals on camera with each other, not allowing people to finish their sentences, screaming, throwing stuff. But yet me and you can sit here and actually discuss one of the most controversial subjects in history and maintain it so well. I think that's a compliment for both of us. And I think a lot of the compliments also goes to our audience who's watching this as well. And I mean, I think they've all done very well. I think it says a lot about me, it says a lot about you, and it says a lot about our followers actually too. Yeah, so I definitely appreciate this. Like I said, I definitely want to do this again. And I'll get off here before your phone finally kills over.
All right, man. I appreciate this, man. If you ever need me live on your channel, let me know. We could do this again live on the channels, or we could just set it up. And I'll get this video downloaded, and I'll get it to you in a couple hours. Okay?
Excellent. Sounds good.
All right, my friend. Good talking to you.